They called me in late, just as I was stepping out of my boots and halfway through a lukewarm coffee that tasted more like metal than anything resembling warmth. The dispatcher's voice was rushed, not panicked, but clipped in that way you only hear when something's not quite right, but no one wants to say it aloud. One more tonight. Simple. No family. Morgue signed off already. Just dirt and done. Those were the words, almost exactly, and I could feel them settle in my bones the way grave dust settles in your fingernails. I've buried a lot of people alone. Veterans, addicts, people whose names got lost in the folds of bureaucracy or deliberately forgotten by the world around them. This wasn't supposed to be any different. They told me he had no ID, no next of kin, no background worth recording. A John Doe with nothing but a medical tag and a delivery form that looked like it had been filled out in a hurry. Half the boxes left blank and the morgue's stamp crooked, like someone wanted to be done with the paperwork as fast as possible. The body arrived in a plain pine box, the kind you only see when the city's footing the bill and no one's coming to mourn. There was no hearse, just a plain white van with no plates on the back, like something out of a half-forgotten dream. 2 men unloaded the coffin, both of them in gray uniforms with no name tags, no conversation, no eye contact. They moved like people who had done this before but didn't want to remember how many times. One of them handed me a clipboard and pointed to a line. Sign here. Bottom. I did. I didn't ask questions because men like me don't get answers, and most times we don't want them. He gave me a wooden cross, unpainted, splintered at the edges, with no inscription. This goes up after. That was it. No prayer, no note, just dirt and done. The grave had already been dug, plot B73, far back against the chain-link fence where the trees grow too wild and the earth never seems to settle. I've always hated that section. Something about the soil feels too loose, like it's never satisfied, but that's where they sent me. I backed the cart up as close as I could and slid the box into place. It made a dull thump as it hit the bottom, not the usual muffled thud, but something sharper, more final, like a door closing down in the dark. I knelt by the edge, not out of habit but something else. Maybe guilt, maybe instinct. My fingers brushed against the lid as I reached down to adjust the straps, and I swear to God I felt something twitch beneath the wood. Just once. Just enough to make my chest go tight and my throat catch. I pulled my hand back fast, told myself it was nothing. Just settling, nerves, tension in the joints, whatever lie I needed to keep going. I covered him slowly, methodically, the way I always do. 3 shovels of dirt. Pause. 3 more. The rhythm helps. It keeps your mind busy, keeps the silence from leaking in. And still, with every layer I added, it felt like the air got heavier, not colder, just weighted, like the ground didn't want to take him. I hammered the cross into the soil with the back of the spade and turned to leave, but something made me look back. I don't know why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was that twitch. The wood looked wrong, off-center. I walked back, nudged it into place, and that's when I noticed it. Something lodged between the cracks of the cross, like a scrap of cloth or a torn piece of paper. I leaned down to inspect it, but as I touched it, it crumbled away, almost like ash. Nothing left. That should have been the end of it. Another nameless grave, another night shift done. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest, like I had just closed the door on something I was supposed to leave open. At home, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the cross, that wooden sliver, the way the box jolted when it hit the earth. I told myself it was fatigue, that I'd buried hundreds before and would bury hundreds more. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just a man without a name. It was something else. Something deliberately erased. The next morning I went back before sunrise. Not because I had to, but because I needed to. The grave looked normal, quiet, but the air still felt wrong, like walking into a room where someone had just stopped speaking. I stood there a long time, staring at the freshly turned dirt, and for the first time in years I whispered a name, not his, because I didn't know it. Mine. I said it softly, like trying to remember who I was. The wind didn't answer, but the ground seemed to hold its breath. I should have walked away after that first night, but I didn't. That kind of unease doesn't leave you. It clings like smoke in your clothes or wet earth under your nails. I tried to distract myself with routine. The headstones to clean, weeds to cut, paths to rake. But every few minutes I'd glance back toward plot B73, and each time I looked, it felt like the trees leaned just a little further inward, like they knew something I didn't. Around noon, I got a call from the office. "Hey," the voice said. A kid I didn't recognize, probably new. "There's something here for you. Says, personal. Do not open." He chuckled. Weird, right? I didn't answer. My stomach sank like a rock dropped into a well. I'll leave it in the drawer at the shed. I hung up without another word and made my way back toward the maintenance shed with steps that felt too slow, too heavy, like my body was resisting what my mind was already starting to suspect. The drawer was one I rarely used. The third down, slightly warped, metal bent from rust and age. Inside was a plain white envelope, heavy, thicker than it should have been. No return address, no markings, just my name, neatly typed, and under it in red ink, "Do not open until sundown." My fingers hesitated over the edge, torn between tearing it open and throwing it into the furnace. I didn't do either. I placed it in my coat pocket and zipped it shut, like locking away a thought you're not ready to face. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. Every sound, the caw of the crows, the creak of the wheelbarrow, the crunch of leaves, felt exaggerated, too crisp, as if the world had turned up the volume just to remind me I was still here. I avoided B-73 as long as I could, but sundown was coming, and like the envelope, the grave demanded attention. I stood above it again just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that made the earth look bruised. The cross was still there, untouched, but something had changed. The ground seemed flatter, almost smoothed out, like the mound had settled in on itself faster than it should have. I reached into my coat and pulled out the envelope. It felt warm somehow, not from my body heat, from within. I broke the seal carefully, fingers trembling more than I'd admit. Inside were two things, a photograph and a second, smaller envelope. This one sealed in red wax with no markings at all. The photo was old, black and white, edges curled. It showed a group of men in funeral uniforms like mine, only older, 70s, maybe 60s. In the center, a man who looked almost exactly like me. Same brow, same chin, same faint scar above the left eye. But it wasn't me. The photo was dated 1961. On the back, written in the same red ink, "He knew, but he didn't listen." I didn't open the second envelope. Not yet. I couldn't. I folded it back into the first, and stood there until the sky turned navy, and the stars began to wink through the gaps in the clouds. I kept expecting someone to step out from behind the trees, to tap me on the shoulder, to say my name in a voice I wouldn't recognize. But nothing came. Just the wind and the distant rustle of dry leaves shifting in patterns that almost sounded like words. That night I took the envelope home with me. I placed it on my nightstand and stared at it until my eyes burned. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face from the photo. Not mine, not exactly, but near enough to make my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of memory, a coincidence, a long-lost relative maybe. But the more I stared at the photo, the more I realized the man wasn't just similar. He was older. He had the look of someone who'd lived a version of my life already. Same uniform, same graveyard, same weary slouch in the shoulders. It was me, or it would be, if I stayed. Just before dawn, I gave in. I unsealed the second envelope. Inside was a note, handwritten, cursive, neat and deliberate. It said, "Do not bury what you don't understand. Do not speak when the soil whispers. And if you see your own name carved in stone, walk away, quickly." Beneath the note was a smaller photo. This time, it was of a headstone. My name, my full name. Birth date correct. No death date. Just a blank line, waiting. I dropped the envelope like it burned, stumbled back against the wall and stared at the ceiling for a long time, heart pounding in my ears like a funeral drum. I wanted to throw it all away, pretend none of it happened, chalk it up to stress, lack of sleep, some elaborate prank. But I knew, deep in the marrow of me, I knew, this wasn't over. Whatever that body was, whoever had come in that pine box with no ID and no name, it wasn't meant to be buried. Or maybe it was, but not by me. Or maybe it was always meant to be me. I just hadn't understood the trade. Not yet. The morning after opening the envelope, I returned to the cemetery like I had every day for years. But everything looked different, and not just because of the fog that refused to lift from the tree line, or the birds that remained silent until well past noon. It was the air itself, charged with a kind of quiet electricity that made my skin prickle and the hairs on the back of my neck stand like thin wires. I passed by the usual rows, nodded to stones I knew by memory, Thompson, Reyes, Ada Mae Wilkins, but I didn't stop until I reached B-73. The wooden cross was still there, leaning slightly left now, as if whatever force had been buried underneath was pushing back, subtly but persistently. I told myself I was just imagining things, but I also found my hand gripping the handle of my shovel a little tighter than necessary. I had buried hundreds of bodies over the years, maybe more, and they all settle into a kind of final stillness within a day or two. The shoulders relax, the mouth slackens, the weight of the world finally eased, But this one had been different from the start. When I'd first opened the body bag, I noticed how the man's arms weren't just crossed over his chest. They were locked there, hands balled into loose fists, almost like he had resisted whatever came for him in his last moments. There was tension in his neck, in the curvature of his spine, a posture I'd only seen in people who died with the full knowledge they weren't supposed to. It wasn't rigor mortis. I've seen that. This was composure. Like he wasn't at peace, not because he feared death, but because he knew it was unfinished. I had to see him again. I told myself it was to verify something, for documentation purposes, to check if there had been a mistake in the burial form. But deep down, I just wanted to confirm he was still dead, that he hadn't changed, shifted, sat up sometime in the night. I unlocked the maintenance shed, retrieved the tools, and walked back to the grave. The ground wasn't as firm as it should have been. It gave too easily under the shovel, like it remembered me. Each layer I peeled back brought with it a growing sense of dread. Not guilt exactly, but anticipation. The same feeling I used to get when I was a kid, tiptoeing into my grandmother's basement after dark, knowing something was down there but never brave enough to turn on the light. When I reached the coffin, the wood was damp and darker than I remembered. I hesitated before lifting the lid, my breath misting in the cold air, my hands trembling slightly though the morning wasn't particularly cold. And then I opened it. He was there, still, but not the same. His hands were no longer clasped. One arm rested against his side. The other was folded over his stomach, loosely, with the fingers curled inward as if reaching for something that wasn't there. I stared, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the wind moving through the trees. His mouth was slightly ajar now, his lips parted just enough to suggest speech. There was something smeared on the inside of the lid. I leaned in. Letters. Scratched in with a fingernail, it seemed. Not fresh, not deep, just enough to mark the wood. I waited. That's all. I fell backward into the dirt, scrambled to my feet, slammed the lid closed with shaking hands. I covered it up fast, too fast, shoveling dirt like I was trying to bury a fire, not a man. When I finished, I sat against a tree for what felt like hours, listening to the thump of my own heartbeat in my ears, the whisper of leaves dancing above me like nervous chatter. That night, I dreamed I was lying in a casket, my arms folded, eyes open, unable to speak, unable to scream, just listening as someone above me patted the earth down, tamping it tight, whispering an apology I couldn't answer. I woke with soil under my fingernails and the bitter taste of dirt in my mouth. I hadn't sleepwalked in years, but that morning, I found mud on my sheets, footprints on the hardwood floor, and a set of clothes I didn't remember wearing draped over the foot of the bed. The same uniform I'd worn 2 days before. I don't know why, but I checked the back of my neck in the mirror. There was a bruise. Round, faint, but clearly there, like a thumbprint. The posture of the dead man haunted me all day. I tried to sketch it from memory, then compared it to the photos in the cemetery logbook. Nothing matched exactly, but one image stood out. A burial from 1984. Same position, same unmarked grave. The entry note beside it read, "Delivered at dusk. Unclaimed. Buried with care." The photo was grainy, but I could swear the man looked familiar. I scanned the page. No name, just a number. But the coordinates? B73. Same grave, same position. 2 bodies, 40 years apart. Same plot, same posture. My stomach turned. A deep twisting in my gut like something ancient and hungry had just turned its gaze toward me. I slammed the logbook shut and told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was unraveling, pulling at strings that didn't need to be touched. But the posture wasn't just a coincidence. It was a warning, or a preparation, or maybe an invitation. I didn't know then, but I would soon. That night came heavier than usual, the kind of evening that drops not like a curtain, but like a casket lid, final and suffocating. I didn't bother with dinner. I paced the hallway, opened and closed windows, stood at the back door watching the silhouette of the cemetery behind the tree line, and told myself it was just a job, that the things I had seen, the body's odd posture, the faint lettering inside the lid, the match with the old photograph, were just byproducts of fatigue and imagination. But fatigue doesn't leave muddy footprints in the kitchen. Imagination doesn't bruise your neck. I tried lying down around midnight, thinking if I forced myself still long enough, sleep would smother the anxiety. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Arms no longer folded, head tilted slightly toward me, as if acknowledging my presence with the faintest smirk, not a cruel one, just patient. That kind of expression you see in old men who've been through too much and know something's coming that you don't. I jolted awake more than once, heart hammering, drenched in sweat, convinced I heard movement outside, gravel under boots, hinges squealing, a shovel dragged across concrete. But every time I looked, the yard was empty, the path untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me from the trees, not with curiosity, but with memory. Around 2:14 a.m., the temperature dropped, sharp and sudden, the way it does before a storm. But there were no clouds, no wind, just cold, dense air that settled into my bones like wet ash. That's when I heard it, soft at first, like fabric moving across wood, then a faint tap. 1, 2, pause, then a third. I sat up, muscles taut, every nerve on alert. The taps repeated, slow and deliberate, from the direction of the front door. I forced myself up, crossed the floor barefoot, each board creaking beneath me like protest. I reached the door, pressed my ear to it, and listened. Silence. Then a whisper, so close I could feel it vibrate against the door frame. You felt it too. I flung the door open. Nothing. Just fog rolling low over the grass. Moonlight diffused into a pale gray haze. But I swear I saw something. Someone. Turning the corner at the far edge of the cemetery fence. I didn't sleep after that. I made coffee I didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table with my coat on, and stared at the sealed envelope from the morgue. I'd left it untouched on the counter, just like they told me. But now it felt like it was breathing, expanding and shrinking ever so slightly, like the envelope had lungs. At 3:12 a.m., I opened it. Inside was a single photo, black and white, grainy, poorly lit. But I knew the image instantly. It was me. Not just someone who looked like me. It was me standing beside grave B73, shovel in hand, looking directly into the camera with eyes I didn't recognize. On the back of the photo, written in faded red ink, "Return what isn't yours." I dropped the photo like it burned, heart slamming so hard it made me dizzy. I stumbled back, caught my reflection in the kitchen window, and for a moment, I swear, I saw a second figure behind me, standing still, half obscured in the dark. No movement, no expression, just presence. When I turned, no one was there. I returned to the envelope. Under the photo was a smaller piece of folded paper. My name. Again. Same handwriting as the note I'd found in the dirt. But this one had a message. You were not the first. I didn't know what it meant. Not fully. But I felt it settle in my chest like a key sliding into a lock I didn't know existed. I went to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer where I kept old photos from my time as an apprentice at the cemetery years ago. And there he was. Not me. Him. The one I buried. In the background of a picture taken in 1996, standing behind a group of gravediggers during a staff photo. Same face, same birthmark. Only I hadn't been hired until 2003. The first uneasy night never really ended. It just bled into the day, staining every corner of my life with suspicion and cold. From that point on, nothing felt solid. Not my memories, not my name, not even the soil beneath my feet. And deep inside, I started to wonder if I had really buried a stranger, or uncovered something I was never meant to see. 2 days had passed since the night I opened the envelope, since the whisper at the door and the photo that shouldn't exist. I hadn't spoken to anyone. I hadn't returned to the cemetery, not even to log the burial in the ledger, or finish the paperwork I'd left half done on my desk. I told myself I was sick, that I needed rest, that the body I buried was just another anomaly in a long string of bureaucratic mistakes. But even as I said it aloud in the mirror, I didn't believe a single word. My own reflection had begun to feel like something borrowed. When I finally did return, it was under the excuse of necessity. A maintenance report, a loose gate latch, something I could fix in the light of day while pretending everything else was still the same. I parked at the far end, where the trees start to close in and the earth stays soft even in summer. The path toward Section B was quiet, though too quiet, like the birds had taken a vote and decided not to come back. I passed markers I'd known for years, Miller, Hartley, the twins whose names were carved into one stone, each familiar name grounding me, reassuring me that I still lived in a world governed by rules. But as I neared B73, that sense of order vanished. The grave looked wrong. It wasn't dug up, not in the obvious way. There was no dirt piled beside it, no signs of forced entry or vandalism. But the soil itself seemed to breathe differently. The mound had settled, not sunk from weather, but slumped inward, like the ground had exhaled. A soft depression, as if the coffin inside had shifted, twisted, or been disturbed. My first instinct was to check the headstone, but of course, there wasn't one. Just the wooden cross, already warped from moisture, the nameplate still blank. I crouched down, brushing away loose leaves, and that's when I noticed something that stopped my breath cold. A single handprint in the earth, not pressed from above like someone kneeling. No, the fingers curved upward, pushing from below. The soil bulged in the shape of a palm, long and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, had been inside had reached up, just once, before going still. I stepped back quickly, scanning the surrounding area, half expecting to see footprints, signs of kids playing a prank, but there was nothing. No marks in the grass, no cigarette butts or candy wrappers, no broken branches, just silence, and the handprint. I walked back to the tool shed, more out of routine than anything else, and checked the logbook. The last person scheduled before me had been Jones, an old-timer who came in on Tuesdays to trim hedges and check irrigation valves. I called him. He picked up after 2 rings, and before I could say anything, he said, "You felt it too, didn't you?" I didn't answer, just stood there, the phone pressed to my ear, hand trembling. Jones sighed, long and deep. "Section B's got a bad vein," he said. "Some parts of this land don't want to stay still. I never touch B-73, not after what happened in '84. I asked what happened, but he hung up. The line went dead like a switch had been flipped. I stared at the receiver, suddenly aware of how loud the world had become. The hum of the overhead lights, the metallic tick of the shovel rack, the creak of the wind against the side of the shed. I turned back toward the grave and felt something shift in my gut. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like walking into a room and seeing your own childhood photo framed on the wall when no one should have had it. I approached the mound again, slower this time, crouched beside the handprint. That's when I saw it. A corner of paper, barely visible under a clump of darkened soil. I brushed it away carefully, my fingertips tingling as if the ground resented my touch. The paper was old, yellowed, creased, the edges curled like dried skin. It had been folded neatly and sealed with red wax, the same kind I'd seen on the envelope at my house. I didn't open it. Not then. I stood and walked away, back down the path, my boots sinking just slightly more than usual into the dirt, as though the cemetery were trying to keep me. I drove home in silence, placed the note on the kitchen table, and stared at it for nearly an hour before breaking the seal. Inside was a single word, my name, written in my own handwriting, but not how I write now. It was the way I used to sign my name in high school, with that crooked underline and exaggerated loop on the R, a style I hadn't used in over 20 years. My hands went numb, my mouth dry. I ran to the hallway closet, pulled out the old yearbooks, and flipped through the pages with shaking fingers until I found my senior portrait. There, in the back, taped to a yellowing page like a forgotten relic, was a note I didn't remember leaving. Same wax seal, same folded paper, and inside, the same name, my handwriting, but I had no memory of ever writing it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, watching the walls, listening for footsteps in the gravel outside, waiting for the soft tap of fingers against glass or wood. But the house was silent, completely still, except at exactly 2:14 a.m., when the lights flickered once, and I heard the whisper again. "Return what isn't yours." Not shouted, not angry, just waiting, like the hands had been, like the man I buried was, waiting for me. I didn't touch the cemetery again for 2 days after finding that note. My name in my own handwriting, sealed in wax, pulled from the very dirt that was supposed to contain a stranger. I left it on the coffee table, but it felt like it followed me from room to room, breathing against the back of my neck, humming beneath the silence like a thread I couldn't cut. I tried to distract myself, scrubbing dishes that were already clean, rearranging the photos on the walls, even reading a manual about graveyard irrigation systems I hadn't looked at in years. But nothing held me. My eyes kept drifting to the corner where that note had been. I had burned it the night I found it, or tried to. The wax bubbled, the paper blackened, but the name never vanished. I stared through the smoke as the curve of each letter lingered, perfectly preserved in the ash, mocking the flames like it didn't belong to the same world as the rest of the page. I swept the remains into the trash with trembling hands and told myself I imagined it. But deep down, I knew better. The handwriting wasn't just mine. It was mine from a version of myself that hadn't existed in decades. That childish swoop in the capital R, the slant to the right as if I couldn't wait to finish the word. It was exactly how I used to sign my name when I was 17. A version of me I hadn't thought about in years. That night, I drank more than I should have. Tried to drown the memory with whiskey and sleep, but neither took hold. I kept waking up at 2:14 a.m. On the dot. Heart pounding, throat dry, room too still. No dreams. Just the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. On the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back to the cemetery, back to B-73. I brought gloves, a small trowel, and a flashlight, telling myself it was just maintenance. Just a professional double-checking a site I had a bad feeling about. But as I approached the grave, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was something sticking out of the earth again. Just barely. a corner of parchment peeking like a tongue from cracked lips. I knelt down, not breathing, and dug with my bare hands. My gloves were still in my pocket, forgotten. The dirt felt warm, not in the sun-baked way, but in the way of breath, of something that had been held close to a chest. I uncovered the note, almost identical to the first, sealed again in wax, heavier this time. I held it up to the light, half expecting it to vanish or crumble, but it stayed solid, pulsing faintly with heat. My name was carved into the seal, not written, carved, as if by a nail or a knife. I broke it. The wax cracked, flaking into my lap, and the paper unfolded on its own, like fingers stretching after sleep. This time, it wasn't just my name. It was a sentence. "You buried the wrong man." I read it again and again, the words blurring as my mind tried to deny them. I knew that body. I handled it myself. I lowered it into the ground, but the thought had already begun to spread through me like ink in water. What if I didn't bury someone else? What if I buried myself? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. The face, the scars, the familiarity I couldn't place, the buried handwriting, my teenage signature, the whispers, the heat, the feeling that someone had been waiting. All of it pointed to something I couldn't explain. I ran back to the shed, locked the door, pulled out the burial log again. The name column was blank, just a string of dashes. The file number led nowhere. The morgue signature was a smear, untraceable. I flipped to the previous entries, looking for context, and found a sticky note tucked inside the back cover, dated 2 years ago. It read, "If the paperwork returns to your name, leave the grave closed. Do not dig, do not ask. No initials, no indication of who wrote it." But the handwriting looked like mine. Not current, not high school, but from a middle era, maybe college. My fingers trembled. I put the book down, paced the room, tried to breathe through the rising pressure behind my eyes. That's when I noticed my shovel. The one I always kept hanging on the second hook from the right. It was gone. I hadn't brought it that day. I checked the rack again. It wasn't misplaced. It was missing. As I turned to leave, I saw a smear of mud on the inside of the door. Not on the outside where boots might mark it. On the inside, at waist level, as if someone had dragged it with their palm. 5 streaks, finger length, leading away from the rack toward the floorboards. I knelt, touched the smears. Still damp, still soft, like they had been made just minutes before. I opened the floor hatch, an old root cellar we used for storm supplies, and peered down, empty, but not silent. I could hear breathing, slow, even, waiting. I slammed it shut, locked it, and stumbled outside into the fading daylight. The graveyard no longer looked peaceful. It looked watchful. Every tree a spine, every headstone a gaze. I told myself I'd quit, that I'd resign, that someone else could take the night shift. But that night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed. No number, just the message. Grave 74. You missed one. There is no Grave 74. At least, not officially. The grid ends at 73. But I got up, got dressed, and went back anyway. I had to see it. I had to know if the dirt had been moved again, if another note had appeared, if my name was still the only one being written. I had to find the shovel. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the sky shift from black to gray, waiting for the first hint of dawn to give me the excuse I needed to return to the cemetery. I told myself I was going back to check on the grave, but the truth clung to my chest like a second skin. I needed answers. Not from anyone alive, but from the dirt, from the sealed box beneath it, from the thing I had buried that now seemed less like a stranger and more like a reflection I had tried to forget. The walk back felt shorter than usual, or maybe I moved faster, driven by that low, humming anxiety that had been building inside me since the first envelope. I passed the rows of stone, the older markers with names weathered off, and the newer ones still glinting like polished teeth in the morning light. But all I saw were mirrors, variations of silence carved into rock. When I reached B73, I stopped and just stared. The ground had settled again, the way it does after fresh rain, too perfect, too smooth, like something had patted the earth from beneath, smoothing its own blanket. I crouched and brushed the dirt with my fingers. No note this time, no signs of tampering, and yet I knew the grave wasn't at rest. Not because of anything physical, but because I could feel it, like an echo vibrating in my ribs. I turned and walked straight to the shed, unlocked the backroom cabinet, and pulled out the burial documents again. Same page, same signature line with nothing but dashes. But this time, I did something I hadn't dared before. I opened the fingerprint archive. It's against protocol for a groundskeeper. That information's reserved for city clerks and law enforcement. But I'd worked there long enough to know the system. I scanned the image from the original intake form and ran a basic match against the employee records, just to prove to myself that I was wrong, that this was all in my head. The match came back in less than 10 seconds. 98% match. To me. Not a relative, not a coincidence. Me. Same pattern, same scars, same deformity on the right ring finger where I slammed it in a car door when I was 13. I stared at the screen for so long it dimmed and logged me out. I sat in that cold metal chair and tried to breathe, but the air tasted like rust. My hands were slick with sweat, even though the room was freezing. I wiped them on my jeans and turned to the mirror behind the door. I looked older than I had yesterday. Not tired, aged, like something had drained a week from me overnight. My face stared back, and I didn't recognize the way I blinked. I left the shed and walked aimlessly, my boots crunching the gravel path, trying to make sense of what I'd found. I thought of the man in the coffin, the way his hands had been folded, the unnatural tension in his limbs. It hadn't felt like rigor mortis. It had felt like resistance, like he had held himself together as long as he could, waiting for someone to see, waiting for me. I returned to the office and pulled my old ID badge from the drawer. It still had the photo from my first week on the job, nearly 20 years ago. I held it up beside the morgue's intake photo. The hair was shorter, the cheeks a little fuller, but everything else matched. The eyebrows, the line of the jaw, even the faint shadow under the left eye from a permanent lack of sleep. My eyes, my mouth, my face. But how? I hadn't died. I was here. I was alive. I had a heartbeat, a breath, a memory. Didn't I? I needed to see the body again. That thought clawed at me, unreasonable and undeniable. I had to exhume the coffin, open it, look the man in the face one more time. I justified it a dozen ways, checking for a burial error, confirming identity, city audit, but none of it mattered. What mattered was the hole I felt in my chest, the gnawing uncertainty that I had buried something I wasn't allowed to forget. That night, I returned alone. I didn't sign the log, didn't alert the night crew. I brought a single lantern and my shovel, the original one, which I found back on its hook, though I swear I'd seen it missing before. I dug with steady hands, not rushed, not frantic. The dirt came up soft, as if it welcomed the effort. Within 45 minutes, I hit the lid. My heart was hammering. I brushed off the top, positioned the light, and opened it. The body was still there, still cold, still dressed in the same plain shirt and slacks, but the skin looked newer, less pale. The stubble on the chin had grown, faint but undeniable. The nails were longer, and the face looked more like mine than ever. Not in memory, in real time. I touched the hand. It was firm, warm, not fully alive but not empty either. I whispered, "Who are you?" The eyes opened, just for a second, enough for me to see that they were mine. And in that flicker, I felt the moment snap, not like a scream or a crack, but like a hand slipping into a glove. Familiar, final. I don't remember closing the coffin, or filling the grave. I only remember waking up the next morning on my couch, clothes muddy, palms raw, head aching. There was a single piece of dirt-covered paper on my chest. It said, "Welcome back." The handwriting was mine, the version I use now, mature, precise. And for the first time in days, I felt calm, like something had been settled. But I also felt watched, not by someone else, by myself, from somewhere just beneath the surface, somewhere I had already been. I didn't go to work the next day. I told the office I was sick, and maybe that wasn't a lie, because my reflection was beginning to feel more like a costume than a truth. I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope still folded beside me, rereading the note over and over again, like some hidden meaning would rise out of the letters if I stared long enough. Welcome back. It wasn't a greeting. It was a replacement. The kind of thing you'd say to someone who had been gone longer than they were supposed to. Someone stepping back into a role they had abandoned. And I kept thinking about those eyes in the coffin. My eyes, opening, not in shock or confusion, but with recognition, like they knew I'd be standing there, like they were waiting for me to finally understand. The pieces were scattered and jagged, but the shape was forming. I hadn't buried a stranger. I'd buried a version of myself, and someone had arranged it. Someone had planned every step of it. The name left off the marker, the instructions to bury by sundown, the note written in my own hand. But who and why? My thoughts kept circling back to the morgue, to the tech who handed me the envelope in the first place. Her name was Ray. I barely remembered her face from that night. My mind was too clouded with routine. But now I needed to see her again. Not to accuse her, just to ask, just to understand if she had seen what I saw. I drove to the county building just before closing. The receptionist gave me a tired look but pointed me toward the back hallway. Ray was sitting in the break room, sipping coffee, her lab coat folded on the chair next to her. She looked up as I entered, and her face changed, not in confusion, but in something colder. Calculation. "You came back," she said, as if she'd been expecting someone else. I didn't sit. I asked her if she remembered the night she gave me the envelope, the nameless body, the signature that wasn't signed. Her answer was immediate. "You brought him in," she said. "Middle of the night. Said it was a city transfer. No paperwork, but you had the key. I recognized your voice. You wore that same coat." My stomach turned. "I never brought anyone in," I told her, and my voice cracked on the word, never. She shrugged like it didn't matter. "That's what you said at the time, too. That you'd forget afterward. That it wouldn't matter, because he'd be gone." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was talking to someone who had rehearsed this moment long before I arrived. She reached into her locker and pulled out a clipboard. On it, the intake form, stained and smudged. The signature line was filled in now, and it was my name, not typed, not forged, written exactly the way I sign it. I stared at it for what felt like hours, but Ray was already packing her things, moving past me like I wasn't even there. "You were always the one," she said softly, almost kindly. "He was just holding your place." I drove home with the paper still in my lap, the signature burning into me. I didn't remember writing it. I didn't remember bringing a body, but Ray's face told me she wasn't lying. Or maybe the better truth was that she was no longer lying. That night, I sat in the dark again, but this time I didn't feel alone. My apartment was quiet, but too quiet, the kind that has weight, like silence pressing in through the walls. I thought about the memories that had begun to feel out of order, little things, like not remembering the exact day my father died, or forgetting the color of the kitchen tile I had walked on for years. It was as if pieces of my life had been borrowed, edited, or replaced. I looked in the mirror again, and I saw the same eyes as before, but the man behind them was not someone I trusted. He was someone who had lied to himself so long that the lie had fossilized into truth. But the dirt doesn't forget, and the grave had spoken. I understood now that whoever, or whatever, I had buried was never supposed to be separate from me. It was a shell, a copy, a promise. And for some reason, I had been the one to make the trade. Not out of fear, out of purpose. I had given something away, maybe years ago, maybe willingly, but now it was coming back to collect. The grave hadn't been disturbed from the outside. It had been opened from within, not as an escape, but as a reminder, a return, and that meant it wasn't over. I folded the form and put it in the drawer with the envelope and the note. The pile was growing, like a dossier on myself, and somewhere inside, I felt the next step forming, like a path under fog. I had to go back to the cemetery, not to work, not to investigate, but because something had been left open, and it had my name on it, just not the version I was used to. The one they meant to bury wasn't the body, it was the memory, and memory, once disturbed, doesn't settle quietly, not when it's yours, not when it remembers more than you do. I returned to the cemetery under the kind of night that never fully settles, one where the air hangs thick, unsure if it wants to become fog, or just cling to your skin like sweat. I didn't bring a flashlight. I didn't need one. I knew the path by heart. I walked past the newer graves, the ones with flowers and photos and names carved by the living, and made my way toward the older corner, the forgotten row. That's where the ground seems different. Not just aged, but exhausted. As if the earth has been asked too many times to keep its secrets and has begun to resent it. I stopped beside the grave I knew too well now, the one with no stone, no name, and yet somehow the center of everything. I sat down slowly, the same way one might sit beside a hospital bed, unsure if they're a visitor or a patient. I had the envelope with me, the note with my name, the intake form from the morgue. I didn't expect answers. I didn't expect company. I just needed to be near it again. The dirt was still fresh-looking, despite the days that had passed. That's not how graves work, even the ones that are filled properly, but this one looked like it had been breathing, or waiting. I spoke softly. I didn't know who, or what, I was talking to. "Why me?" I asked. "Why now?" My voice didn't echo. It sank, as if the ground was drinking every syllable. For a while, nothing happened, just whine through crooked branches. But then I heard it. Not a voice. A rhythm. A sound like earth being moved, but not violently, carefully, deliberately, as if someone was digging from inside out. I didn't run. I didn't speak again. I just listened. The sound wasn't frantic. It was patient, almost intimate. And then I realized it wasn't digging. It was carving. I don't know how I knew, but I felt it deep in my ribs. Something beneath me was shaping the ground, not to escape, but to build. I thought of the intake form, of Ray's voice saying, "He was just holding your place," of the body with my face, my scar, my silence. I wasn't burying a stranger. I was shedding a skin. Maybe a version of me that had once made a deal, one I forgot but never canceled. Maybe this was the debt coming due. I spoke again, but not with fear. "What did I give you?" I asked. "What did I get in return?" The dirt answered in tremors, not words. A slow vibration through the soles of my shoes, crawling up my spine. It felt like a heartbeat. Not mine, not human, but steady. A pulse beneath the cemetery. The kind of thing that doesn't ask permission to exist. It simply is. And then came the whisper. It didn't rise from the ground. It bloomed inside my mind, quiet and full of memory. "You asked to forget," it said. "I let you." The words weren't angry. They were kind, sad, like a parent reminding a child of something painful but necessary. "You left something behind," the whisper continued. "You needed to, but now it's time to come back." I felt tears on my face, not from fear, but from a sorrow I didn't know I carried. A grief for a part of me I had once discarded, thinking I'd never need it again. I had asked to forget, and something had granted that request. But it came with a cost. I had forgotten who I was, and now I was being reminded, not with punishment, but with an invitation. The digging stopped. Silence fell again, but not emptiness, a fullness, like the final note of a song that's been waiting to resolve for decades. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but my heart was quiet. I looked down at the grave. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I whispered, "Thank you," and I meant it. I walked back through the cemetery, the envelope still in my hand, but it felt lighter now, not empty, released. I didn't know what would come next, whether that grave would ever open again, whether I would, but I knew something had been returned to me, not a memory, not even a truth, but a weight I had once chosen to carry, and had finally remembered how to hold. I returned at first light, unsure if it was out of duty or desperation. The cemetery was silent in a way only places that cradle the dead can be. No birdsong, no wind, just the sound of my own breath fogging up in the morning air. I walked slowly, each step measured, as if I feared what I might find yet couldn't bear not to. My hands were bare even though the frost bit at them. I wanted to feel the cold, to be sure I was still alive. I reached the grave expecting it to be disturbed again, but it wasn't. The earth was perfectly leveled. The wooden cross stood straight. Even the grass seemed untouched, almost too pristine for something that had been unearthed and reshaped by something, or someone, beneath. I knelt beside it, not to pray, but to listen. I waited for the whisper, for the digging, for anything. But the ground was still, and that stillness was louder than sound. I stood and turned to leave when I saw it. Just a few rows down, where the trees lean inward like old women gossiping, was a new plot. The dirt was darker, fresher, moist like a wound that hadn't dried yet. But there was no headstone, just a shovel, folded, resting upright, as if waiting for hands that knew its weight. And above it, hanging on the wooden frame like a scarecrow's spine, my coat, the one I had worn the night I first buried the nameless man. I hadn't worn it since. I hadn't even remembered where I left it. But there it was, sleeves limp in the wind, collar upturned just like I wore it. I approached slowly, heart thudding in a rhythm not quite my own. The grave wasn't wide, it wasn't deep, but it was ready. It looked prepared not for a body, but for a return. I stepped closer. There was no name on the placeholder cross, just a single wax seal nailed to the top beam, the same wax that had closed the envelope with my name. I reached out and touched it. It was warm. The shovel beside the grave wasn't just mine. It was aged differently, as if it had been used longer than I'd been alive, but it bore the same nicks, the same crack in the handle. I could feel the indentations my grip had worn into it over years, except it didn't feel like just memory. It felt recent, present, like I had used it last night. I whispered aloud, "Is this for me?" The wind answered, not with sound, but with motion. A single leaf fell into the open grave, spinning once before settling flat. Then came the scent, not rot, not soil, but something older, like paper just before it burns. I stepped back, pulse quickening. The coat rustled behind me. For a second, I swore I saw the shape of a person wearing it, just a flicker of posture in the corners of my sight. I didn't dare turn around. I just said, "I'm not ready." The grave didn't close. The coat didn't fall, but something shifted in the air. A kind of patience, as if whatever was here agreed to wait, but only for a while. I stood there, not sure how long, watching the shadows stretch across the grass as the sun rose higher. No voice spoke again. No name was carved. But the message was clear. The trade had been acknowledged. The return had been accepted. But the burial, it hadn't yet been completed. I walked away that morning not as the same man. I don't know if I walked away at all. Sometimes I wonder if I ever left that place. If the part of me that returned to the world is just the echo, and the real me is still standing there beside that grave that waits without impatience, without anger, but with certainty. I don't wear that coat anymore, but I feel it sometimes, like a memory pressing against my shoulders. I don't speak of the man with no name, but I see his face in dreams. And sometimes, when I walk past mirrors, I hesitate, because I'm not always sure which reflection I'm going to see. And when I pass by that corner of the cemetery, even if it's from a distance, I still hear the digging, steady, patient, not desperate, almost forgiving, like it knows, like it remembers, like it's still waiting.